Evening, everybody. Welcome to another Apologia. You'll have to forgive me. I've got crutches buried underneath me on the front row, so I'll save you the burden of having me hobble up there and back down. So I'm just going to paint a quick picture of what the evening holds for us, and then we'll invite our guest, Dr. Titus, out, and we'll get into our evening. So just in case this is your first time with us, welcome. We're glad to have you. We're going to spend an hour in conversation between Pastor Alec and our guest to hit a couple of the big topics. We'll take a 15-minute intermission to use the restroom, get some water, and some extra time to explore the tables in the lobby. And then we'll come back for the Q&A portion, which is what we all really enjoy, where you are able to text questions in. We're never able to get to all of them, but we do our best. So in the meantime, let me tell you where the bathrooms are. They're wildly and conveniently located. The men's restrooms on that side of the lobby, the women's restrooms far on the other side. Good luck finding the water fountains. Lost and Found is right by the men's restroom if you need it. And beyond that, if you'd pull your phones out with me, do two things. First of all, make sure they're silenced for me. That will help our speakers this evening stay on track and get to more questions ultimately. And secondly, keep them out because the number to text questions to is on the screens. So take a picture of that, scribble that down somewhere. And as you have a question, as our evening goes on together, text it immediately as you have it. Don't wait until the end or something, because what we're doing in this first hour is compiling them all, and then we print them out and get the list up there on stage. So as you have a question, text it in, and we'll do our best to get to it. So aside from that, you may have had the chance already to scope out some of the tables in the lobby. We've got two tables out there. FPIW, the Family Policy Institute of Washington, is a great organization, it does all the legwork for you to keep on track of legislation that people of faith, particularly parents, would be curious to be aware of in our state. So that's a great table. Get on their email list. And also we have a book table with some of Dr. Titus's books that you can purchase if you like what he has to say. And beyond that, we also have someone from our community here in Edmonds, Jody, who is leading a bipartisan effort to scrub the voter rolls before the next election cycle. So she'll have a moment later in the evening to give you some brief information. She doesn't have a table, but we'll get a face to the name so you know what who she is and what she looks like, so you can connect with her in intermission or after Apologia altogether this evening. All right? So with that being said, I feel as though I should have brought a piece of parchment or something, or a tablet of stone for the bio of our guest this evening. It's quite long, so I'll do my best here. But Dr. Kennedy is a field archaeologist who works primarily with biblical sites and related materials, and he's been involved in excavations and surveys at several sites and has directed and supervised a number of them as well. He currently is a research fellow at the Discovery Institute, who we're familiar with, and are local to the Seattle area, which is great. He teaches as an adjunct professor at Biola University and has served as a consultant, writer, and guide for various history and archaeological documentaries and curricula. Now strap in, because here is his academic acumen. Holds a BA from Biola University, an MA from the University of Toronto, an MA from the University of South Africa, and a doctorate in literature and philosophy from the University of South Africa. So without further ado, would you help me welcome our guest this evening?
Am I on the right?
Yeah,
okay.
You're over there.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Welcome. It's great to see you here tonight. And Pastor Eric has already introduced our guests for the evening. And I've got so many questions here that reining me in is going to be a challenge. But we'd like to just start by having you share with us, Dr. Kennedy, a little bit. I was intrigued to see in your biography that you've done a lot of your training in South Africa. That's where I was born. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So at University of South Africa, I did my doctorate and also my second master's, because they have a program in biblical archaeology specifically, not just in general archaeology, and I was looking to do that concentration. I didn't even know about the program until a friend of my dad's suggested that I look into it, and I contacted one of the professors there, and sort of the rest is history.
Awesome. So you spent time outside of Pretoria, particularly? It was University of Pretoria you went to, right?
University of South Africa. Their main campus is in Pretoria. Yes.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I can't tell you how glad we are, how glad I am. Forget the audience. I can't tell you how glad I am that you are here. I've had the privilege of going with our groups of people from Westgate over the years to Israel. And I'm just intrigued by how validating that is for one's faith. And looking at your newest book, Excavating the Evidence for Jesus, I'm excited to jump right in with the Jesus narrative and some of the work that you've done, particularly some of the things you've explained in the book. And so the first question I'd like to ask is there historical corroboration for that Roman census? The whole Jesus birth narrative is built around the decree of Augustus. Tell us some of the work that you've done on that and how validating that is for the very beginning of the Christ narrative.
Right, that's a really great question, because it's actually one of the sections in the Gospels that's often criticized by scholars and skeptics, but we do have archaeological material that connects to and even corroborates that census. So Luke tells us in chapter 2 that Caesar Augustus, issued this empire-wide census. So that's one criteria that we have to look at. Where's an empire-wide census? And in the records of Augustus himself, basically his autobiography, he talks about 3 empire-wide censuses that he ordered, and one of those was issued in 8 BC. Of course, Herod the Great, he died in 4 BC, so we're looking for a census that was issued not too long prior to that. So that's one aspect of it. But then Luke goes on and he says that Quirinius was the one who administered this locally, and he says that he was a ruler in Syria. Usually it's translated as governor, but it could mean several different positions of power. So Quirinius was a very famous Roman aristocrat, politician. He was a general, he was also a governor at times. And during this period, he's known from Roman records to be in that area of Syria and also a little bit to the north. But there's a very interesting burial inscription that was found in Beirut. So at the time, that was Roman Syria province. And it's one of the officers under the command of Quirinius. He talks about Caesar Augustus in power. He talks about Quirinius, the legate. So this would be essentially like a general or a governor, depending on if he's a civil or military position. And he talks about a census. And so, we have some other material too, but it really all connects very well to sometime soon after 8 BC, prior to 4 BC.
So somewhere in that window. Why Bethlehem? Why did they have to go to Bethlehem?
Well, we see in Luke 2 that was essentially the hometown or the family home of Joseph. Now, Roman protocol was that you had to go to where you were registered or where your hometown was, kind of like voting was in the past and still is in a lot of places, where if you wanted to vote, you had to go to the actual location where you're registered. So Joseph's family is from Bethlehem. He's of the line of David, and he's got to go back there. And according to Roman census papyri, especially from Egypt, where quite a few have been recovered, we see that people did have to go back to their hometowns and then fill out the census material and turn that into a government official.
So that fits together. So if it's not too complicated without having it in front of us to read or to see, talk about the dating of Jesus' birth. I know there's been quite a bit of debate. Those of us who are not in your field tend to go by the, would have been the year 1 AD or talk to us about the dating of Jesus' birth.
So the whole BC AD system was put together by a monk. Sometimes he goes by the name Dennis. But this was done, Dionysus actually was his name, but This was done hundreds of years after the time of Jesus. And he did his best putting together all the historical information, but it seems that he was lacking some key sources, so he didn't quite get the timing right. And we see in Matthew that Herod the Great is the king when Jesus is born, and he's in power for a bit after that. And then eventually he dies, and we see Joseph takes the family back from Egypt. So we know that Jesus was born before 4 BC. Herod died in March of 4 BC. So we know Jesus was born before that. Now we look at the census information connecting to Luke, and it would have been after 8 BC it was issued. There's often, well, at least sometimes there was a lag time. We see this in the Roman census material, that it took perhaps a year in some cases for people to respond. So I think around 7 BC is a pretty good number of date, year to assign the birth of Jesus. We can't be 100% dogmatic about it, but the evidence seems to point to that.
So how many of you have been to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem? Raise your hand if you've been there. I don't want to spoil your experience and your recollection, but it was not very impressive to me. It just seemed like a really cheap Christian television set with all the draperies, and so but I understand from your research that you're pretty confident that is where Jesus was born. Can you explain the basis of your confidence in that? Mm-hmm.
Sure. So in the Gospels, it doesn't tell us the exact type of structure where Jesus was born. We just see that there's reference to the manger, which was a feeding trough. So it seems like he was born in a place where the animals were kept. And that could be in a cave, or it could be in a structure. But we have sources as early as the 2nd century that talk about Jesus being born in a certain cave in Bethlehem. Now, you fast forward in time or look from the Roman perspective, Emperor Hadrian goes to Judea around 130 AD, and he starts building these Roman temples and shrines over important locations associated with Jesus. One of the places he did that was where we now have the Church of the Nativity. He built a shrine to the Greek god, or also Roman god, Adonis, over the cave where the local Christians had the tradition that Jesus was born. Now, Bethlehem is a tiny village. There's a continuous Christian presence there. They probably knew the place where Jesus was born. I wouldn't say that we can be 100% certain, but it's pretty likely.
Talk to us also then about the inn. You have some misgivings about it being that he was born in an inn.
Yeah, so that's a completely different word for inn. So kataluma is the Greek word that's used in the nativity narrative. So it's a guest room in a house. And Luke elsewhere uses a different word for an inn, like in the story of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the Good Samaritan. So that's a totally different word. And also Bethlehem was a Judean village, right? It's not a Hellenistic village. And inns were not something that were normal in Jewish culture, but they were more of a Hellenistic and Roman thing. So we wouldn't really expect Bethlehem to even have an inn.
So it was likely in somebody's residence.
It was probably the animal pen, essentially, of one of the family members of Joseph who still had a house in Bethlehem.
Okay. So all of my growing up years, I've believed the attack that Christians have to endure about December 25th. How many of you have heard that December 25th was a pagan holiday that's been adopted and glossed over as a Christian date for Jesus' birth? Let me raise it. All right. Okay. We've all heard that. We felt defensive, but we've just kind of accepted the accusation. You have a totally different perspective on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that December 25th is very likely. At the very least, it's plausible, and it was somewhere around that time. And that's because we go back to very early sources. 2nd and 3rd century, we have 3 sources that talk about December 25th as the birth of Jesus, and March 25th as the conception date. Most notably, Irenaeus, the church father in the 2nd century, talks about that. Now, if we look in the nativity narratives, Luke chapter 1 specifically, and it goes through this timeline, we can get to around December 25th from that, because it starts out, Zacharias is serving in the temple, and it seems like it's Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement type of time period. So that puts it in late September. You go a few verses down, and then it says, after that time, Elizabeth became pregnant with John the Baptist. Now, you go a few more verses down, and it says in the 6th month, so 6 months later, she sees Mary, and then Mary becomes pregnant with Jesus. Okay, so that's March. That's late March. That's March 25th-ish, right? And then 9 months later, we have December 25th. So there's definitely some material in the Gospel of Luke that connects with what some of the early church fathers and other scholars are saying. Now, addressing the whole Roman pagan idea of it, one of the festivals that people often say was just borrowed for Christmas is Saturnalia. But the first problem with this is that it was celebrated from about December 17th to 23rd, okay? So it's not the 25th of December. Saturnalia did predate Jesus, so that is something they have going for them, so to speak, but it's the wrong date. The other one that actually is on December 25th, that is the festival for Sol Invictus, but this comes much later. Emperor Aurelian in 274 AD dedicated a temple to the god Sol on December 25th. And then we see in the 4th century, middle of the 4th century, that there is this Roman festival dedicated to Sol Invictus on December 25th. So this is all after the fact. And when people are saying that Christians just took this pagan holiday and made it Christmas, they're putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah. No, that changes everything. I'm serious. I mean, that's worth the book right there if you don't have a copy of it. So next Christmas, there's a no-guilt celebration of December 25th. I'm so excited about that. Seriously. I've felt sort of, frightened about the accusation and just endured it, and that's freeing. I'm liberated right now by that. Thank you. Thank you. So, one of the things that Eric Metaxas talks about in his book, and I understand he consulted with you on some of the things that he wrote, but he talks about the recent discovery of Jesus' childhood home in Nazareth. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So there was a Byzantine church that was built in part of Nazareth in the 5th century, and they called it the Church of the Nutrition. So they're essentially saying this is where Jesus grew up, right? They're not saying he was born there, obviously.
Right.
And so this is the childhood home, possibly, was built under this. Now, there were excavations done underneath the church, and they did find a 1st century house, and the materials in there demonstrated that the people who lived in this house were Jews who were observant of the Mosaic law. So it certainly fits. Now, many of the Byzantine churches are very reliable in marking these locations connected to the Bible, especially to things having to do with Jesus. This is not one of the ones where I would say we're 99% certain, but it's definitely plausible. It fits. And the things that have been found in Nazareth certainly connect to and corroborate the basic context of the Gospels. Nazareth, small 1st century Jewish village. Whether or not that was the home that Jesus grew up in, we can't say for sure, but it could have been.
How big would Nazareth have been when Jesus was growing up there?
Maybe about 400 people, just based on the size of the city that we can tell from archaeological remains. So really, really small village.
Yeah. So I'm not trying to twist your arm, but the chances of somebody building a church over a random 1st century home is probably unlikely. Mm-hmm. So, and I realize there's never a certainty about these things, but that's very encouraging. Why is the discovery of Byzantine churches such an important marker for archaeologists. I know when you get to Capernaum, and we'll talk about that in a minute, the city that Jesus seems to have spent most of his years in, there is a home that's been discovered there that's relegated to being Peter's home. Why? And of course, there's a Byzantine structure. Why is that so important for archaeology?
So the Byzantines, it's this name that we give to early Christians, essentially. Once the Roman Empire became more Christian, then we switched to using this terminology, Byzantine. So when we're talking about Byzantine, we're talking about 4th century and later, usually 4th to 6th century in this region. After Constantine issues the Edict of Milan in 313, legalizing Christianity, not making it the official religion, but making it legal. Then we start to see these quote-unquote official churches being built. Because before, they just had to meet in houses and be covert about it. And so Constantine sent his mother and an architect to the Holy Land to find out where many of these important biblical locations were, especially ones connected to the life of Jesus, so that they could build churches there to protect the site and to commemorate it and then we'd have it in future generations. So they didn't just go there and randomly pick, like, okay, that looks like a nice location and there's a vacant lot there. The Crusaders, on the other hand, had a problem. So when you're looking at Crusader period churches that are supposedly marking things, they often got stuff wrong because they were just guessing. But the Byzantines, they would go there, they would ask the local bishop and other Christians, and there was usually a continuous Christian presence in those places from the time of Jesus. So, oh yeah, my great-great-grandfather, he knew that Jesus was here at this, pool of Siloam or the pool of Bethesda. And so they would get the correct location from the locals and then they would build the structure over it. And when we've excavated in those places, we see time and time again that they are actually over architecture that fits the story, whether it's, the pool of Bethesda, the pool of Siloam, the tomb of Jesus, the cave where Jesus might have been born, this first century home in Nazareth, many locations like that, the house of Peter, etc. So they're generally very reliable.
What are some of the markers that you look for before, after excavation and research, and you establish in a paper or some publication, pretty confident this is the site for XYZ? What are some of the markers that determine that?
So if we were looking at something like the pool of Bethesda, for instance, first of all, we need to look at the geography. Is it located in the right place? And the geographical references about the pool of Bethesda put it on the north side of Jerusalem. So you go to visit it today, it is on the north side of ancient Jerusalem, first century Jerusalem. Is there a pool there? Yes. Was it a ritual bathing pool where people had to take the steps down into it? Yes, those steps are still there. What is the date established? And we would be looking at things such as pottery fragments and coins. Especially in this period, coins are really helpful and precise. And yes, it was in use in the first century. And then what about, are there Christian traditions and others associated with it? And there are. In fact, Bethesda's another site where Hadrian built a pagan temple. In this case, it was to the god of healing, Asclepius.
And when would that remind me of Hadrian's
Around
dates?
130, 135 AD for that structure, early mid-2nd century. And then there was a Byzantine church built there later on, that when they dismantled the temple and they wanted to remember it for the event in the life of Jesus, not for this pagan structure.
So that's less, what was the date of Hadrian again?
130 approximately.
So that's less than 100 years after Jesus' lifetime.
Yes.
So you can be pretty confident that that's a significant location.
Right, yeah. And in Jerusalem, again, there's a continuous Christian presence there from the time of Jesus into the time of Hadrian. So people aren't clueless about where these things happen. It was a pretty small city, maybe 100,000 people in the first century, if that many, and geographically tiny. So people remembered these significant locations.
So let's switch then to one of the towns that's significant in Jesus' 3 years of ministry, Capernaum. Do you believe that that was the hub and at one point in one of the Gospels, Jesus talks about Jesus returning to his home. Any thoughts about where that home was? Was that Peter's home?
Yeah, that was Peter's home according to the Gospels. So he lived in the house of Peter, which seems to have been the mother-in-law's house originally. And then I guess Peter inherited it. And we go a little bit farther in time, and Peter has abandoned it. He ends up in Rome later in the 1st century, and the church is using it as a meeting place. So I think every scholar accepts that Capernaum was the home base of Jesus during his ministry. It's pretty clear as far as that goes. I haven't seen any other ideas about it.
What about the population of Capernaum during Jesus' ministry?
Well, estimates for that are all over the map, actually, between 3,000 and 15,000. Not the whole city hasn't been uncovered, so it may be a bit larger than what we see now. But I think we could conservatively give an estimate of 8,000 or so, somewhere around there. So it's still fairly small, but it's bigger than a place like Bethlehem or Nazareth.
Okay. Talk about the synagogue. I don't know. How many of you have been to Capernaum? See your hands, been to Capernaum? Talk to us about the synagogue that's there.
So there are 2 synagogues, basically, that are there. They're built on top of each other. The one that everyone sees the most from is the White Synagogue.
That's the one up on the upper portion of the photograph, right?
Right. So that was built beginning in the late 4th century, and then it's finished in the 5th century. And we know that because of coins that were found in the mortar, and then also there's an Aramaic inscription that connects quite well with that. But if you see underneath the white stones, there are black stones, and it's about 3 feet high still, around a meter. And there's this other structure directly underneath it. So in the ancient world, they often built a new synagogue right on the remains of the old one. And this black basalt synagogue was a synagogue that was built in the 1st century, in use in the 1st century. And so that would have been the one that Jesus was teaching in. And it's very, very close to the house of Peter, which is also the impression that we get from reading the Gospels.
One of the houses that's at Capernaum that's close to Peter's house, when you're standing looking at Peter's house, there's a home uncovered off to the left that still has a set of stairs, it appears, going up the outside structure. So is that how, when we read the story about the friends letting their paralyzed friend down through the roof, would they have accessed the roof by a series of steps built outside the perimeter of the home?
Sometimes they built steps inside the home too, and sometimes they used ladders instead of a staircase. It just depended.
Okay, all right. So talk to us then about Bethsaida. The only Bethsaida that I've visited when I've been there is on the northern side end of the Sea of Galilee, and quite a distance from where the water is. But they've uncovered apparently around that site some things that indicate that the water used to be up there. But then there's another site that is closer to the water. Talk to us about those 2 sites for Bethsaida.
Right, so the one that's usually called Bethsaida is the archaeological site. It's called Et-Tel, and it's a ways north of the coast, and it's also considerably higher elevation than the water, than the lake. And so they have to go through this explanation that there was this earthquake that lifted that city up and somehow it remained intact. It doesn't make any sense to me, but there's another site called El Araj, which I think now has really been established as the Bethsaida of the Gospels. It's right on the coast. It's a fishing village right on the coast of the Sea of Galilee, just like Capernaum is, just like Magdala, all the other places. They're still on the water. And it has very definitive 1st century remains. And recently, they actually uncovered a Byzantine church that was built there too, that seems to be connected to the apostles Peter and Andrew were from Bethsaida, of course. So I think that we can identify El Araj on the water there as the Bethsaida talked about in the Gospels.
Cool. I can't wait to go back and I've never visited that site, so I'm looking forward to that. So Magdala is a fairly recent discovery.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that site?
They're doing pretty extensive excavations there at Magdala. And one of the most notable things that was found earlier on in the excavations was this first century synagogue in a very good state of preservation. And so that helps us to understand, what did synagogues look like in the first century? Because most of the ones that we have, they were buried and built over, and we have foundation stones, and that's about it. But at Magdala, we still have the benches where people sat. We had the mosaic floor, and they also had one of those, what we would probably call a Moses seat, that was in the synagogue too, which I think those were used to put the Torah scrolls on.
So the seat of Moses is actually, they've got a replica there, but the original now is in a museum in Jerusalem.
Right.
And talk to us a little bit about what we were talking about in the office, about the recent discovery of a synagogue in Chorazin.
Mm-hmm. So Chorazin was a bit of an issue for the Gospels because they hadn't found first century remains there. But there were excavations going on last year, and the archaeologist says that not only have they found first century remains there, but he thinks that he has evidence for a first century synagogue being there too. And so this is another thing that we read about in the Gospels that has been recently corroborated archaeologically.
So all of this, according to your newest book, provides us with evidence of the reality of Jesus, the person, the Messiah, his ministry, and we're going to get here in a second into his trial and crucifixion. But from your perspective as a scholar, and all of the people that you've associated with and worked with, what all of this does for us, even for those, especially for those of you who have never been to Israel, is provide us with a solid defense that we've got the evidence we need for the reality of Jesus, his life, his death, and resurrection.
Yeah, absolutely. We can go through all these different periods and major events in Jesus' life, and there's archaeological and historical evidence that connects to all of these different periods, places, people.
Yeah, so we can have confidence in our faith. That's one of the things. I love going to Israel, and I'm looking forward to going again sometime. If you've never been, it absolutely brings the Bible alive to you. You will never read the Bible the same after you've been to Israel. It changes your perspective, but also is so affirming to your faith that these stories and locations that we have read about and believed in all of our lives are corroborated by the evidence that you see when you go there. It's a tremendously faith building. So let's jump to Jesus' crucifixion then, and your comments in the book about the dilemma that Pilate was in and why he was so easily pressured into surrendering Jesus for the crucifixion.
Right, so we could say a lot of things about the trial of Jesus because we have archaeological corroboration for the major figures in the trial of Jesus. We have Annas, Caiaphas, Pontius Pilate, Herod Antipas, Jesus. We have the locations, at least part of them are excavated, such as a possible high priestly mansion. We don't know if it's the same one Jesus went to, but the place where the Sanhedrin met at the time of the trial, and then also the Praetorium. And then we have some later Roman sources that mention the trial of Jesus too. But you bring up this issue of Pilate, what's going on with his behavior. And in fact, this is something that is criticized in the Gospels for being historically inaccurate. They think that the way that the Gospels reflect Pilate is not how he was, because they look at Josephus and they see that Pilate was this pretty harsh, actually, fairly typical for a Roman governor, but he was not a pushover, and they see him getting into fights essentially with the Jews about various things. But if we look at the historical context of what's going on right before the trial of Jesus, then it makes sense why Pilate doesn't want to intervene and stop Jesus' execution. In 31 AD, there was the assassination, we might call it an execution, of the head of the Praetorian Guard named Sejanus. And he had almost been ruling the empire for a while because Tiberius was off on this island, not really concerned about being the emperor and intervening in affairs. And so Sejanus was consolidating more and more power. Now, he got into that position the same year that Pilate was appointed governor. We don't know if Pilate was appointed by him or not, but there may have been an association. But in 31, Sejanus is killed. He thinks he's going to become the emperor. The Senate calls him in, but their plot is to eliminate him. And so Pilate is looking at that, and he sees, this is what happens when you get on the bad side of the emperor. Now, Pilate had gotten himself on the bad side of the emperor because he had had these different conflicts with the Jews. He was doing things that he thought would be pleasing to the emperor, putting up monuments and so forth, but it was just making the Jews mad from a religious standpoint. And so they were sending in official complaints to the emperor. And the most recent one probably happened in 32, the year before the trial. And Pilate had saw what happened to Sejanus, so he understood, if I get another official complaint against me, I might get recalled. It might end up in exile or even death for me. And in fact, he had one more in 36 AD. He was recalled, but he was saved because Tiberius died before he got to Rome. So when he's there at the trial of Jesus, he doesn't want to get in a fight with the religious authorities of the Jews. And he figures, this is not worth my career or my life. I don't think this guy is guilty, but fine, do what you want.
Because he seems reluctant in all of the narratives about the trial. He seems reluctant to proceed with the execution.
Yes.
But he succumbs to the pressure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's just not worth it for him.
In your book, you talk about the approximate date of the conclusion of Jesus' ministry and the beginning of the Passion. Where do you put that at?
The year 33 AD, and I think we're able to actually pinpoint the exact date of a few things, like Nisan 9 would be Palm Sunday, Nisan 14 would be the Crucifixion, so that translates to March 29th, 33 AD for today, for Palm Sunday.
So Jesus would have been older than 30 if you take his birth date to be between 4 and 8 BC. Right. He'd have been a little older than 30.
Yes.
When he comes to the end of his
ministry.
ministry.
If he starts his ministry in about 28 AD, which would be the 15th year of Tiberius, we get that from Luke 3:1. And if he was born at the end of 7 BC, then he's probably around 33 years old when he starts his ministry. And Luke says he's about 30, so that it fits well. He's not exactly 30, but he's around that.
So where do you believe the trial took place?
So
I've always thought it was Antonia Fortress. I've always been told it was Antonia Fortress, built off of the northwest corner of the temple precinct.
Right, that's where the tour guides will almost always take you. So, and that was somewhat accepted among scholars for a while, but in the 1970s, there were excavations done on the western side of Jerusalem. Now, Josephus and Philo both talk about the former palace of Herod the Great in Jerusalem being used as the praetorium, the residence of the Roman governor. So there were a lot of scholars who thought that the praetorium was in Herod's palace on the western side of Jerusalem. But those excavations actually turned up what appears to be the Gabbatha, the raised place, the lithos stratos that John talks about, the stone pavement. You can actually still see part of the stone pavement. You can see the bema area that is talked about in the Gospels too. And the way that it was constructed helps us to understand how people like the Pharisees and the priests, they could have been outside of the actual praetorium, but still see Jesus and Pilate at the trial and hear what's going on and then yell, "Crucify him." Because there's a big area out there where you can stand, and then Jesus and Pilate would have been up on this raised place, but there was no wall. It wasn't enclosed to everyone. Now, they didn't want to go inside because they would become ritually unclean and they'd have to go through purification rituals, but Passover was approaching, so they didn't have time to do that.
So this is west of the Temple Mount as we know it today.
This is on the western wall of the old city, yes.
So if any of us went back to Israel, could we request to see that site?
Yeah, you could, and your tour guide may or may not know where it is, but if you just follow the wall, if you go outside of Jaffa Gate and then follow the wall south, you'll run right into it, and you'll see this big gate area with steps going up, and you'll see this thing that it looks like a bema area.
What sites have you personally excavated in Jerusalem?
Mount Zion Excavations is what I was part of for 3 seasons, and that was, in terms of first century remains, we were excavating a priestly house, but there were things from before and after that too.
So talk to us about Caiaphas's palace, or where we believe the first trial or first interrogation would have happened. In Israel, there's a church over the top of it, but you go down into the basement. Our guide, and don't feel comfortable to refute this, but our guide said there are 2 reasons that they're confident this is the place. It was the most palatial home that they've uncovered in that whole area, south of and slightly west of the Temple Mount, and that there were urns discovered in the basement with the word tithing on them or something to that effect, which seemed to tie for them into the fact that this was a priest's home.
Okay, so there are 3 places where we could say we have a priestly mansion from the first century in Jerusalem. I don't know if we can identify any of those with the house of Annas and Caiaphas, but I would probably lean towards the one that's called the burnt house, because we definitively know that it was actually used by a high priestly family. There was an inscription found in there of the Katros family, and they were a high priestly family from after the time of Caiaphas, after the time of Jesus. So maybe it was just their house, but it may have been that the high priest had a specific residence, and if you were the acting high priest, then you were living in that, kind of like the president's house in various countries. So that would be my suggestion, but I don't know exactly where it was.
Right. So does the Antonia Fortress feature in any biblical narrative, like in Acts, where Paul is being beat up and the soldiers, it says they came down?
Yes. I think it's in that one where Paul returns to Jerusalem and then the Roman soldiers save him from the mob.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that's probably, in your opinion, the only place where Antonia Fortress features significantly.
Right, yeah, because that was the barracks for the Roman soldiers, so it wasn't where the governor's palace or mansion was.
Right. All right, so talk to us about where you believe the crucifixion took place.
I would say possibly on the stone hill that is now within the greater complex of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but this is something that we don't have really solid evidence for. We just know, if you look at all the biblical references in the early writings, that it seems like the crucifixion location was very close to the tomb of Jesus. And there is this big stone hill near the tomb site, and it was revered quite early as the place of the crucifixion. So it's possible, but the thing is, it's a hill, right? So we have very difficult time saying that the crucifixions were happening here and it's the crucifixion of Jesus, because it's a geographic location.
And is it outside the city walls? What would have been the city walls?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So Jesus' burial place, do you believe it's really underneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre?
Yeah, that one I would say I'm at least 99% certain.
That's unfortunate.
It is the two.
It's one of my least favorite places to go. But talk to us about why you believe it's the real deal.
All right, so there have been various excavations and investigations done at that site, as well as ancient church fathers writing about the location. So here's essentially what we know about it. The tomb there was a tomb that was carved into the rock in the first century. That was a graveyard in the first century. There are other first century tombs that you can actually see within the confines of the church. It's the right type of tomb, which is this stone carved arcosolium tomb is what it's sometimes called, with the burial bench carved out. It's single chamber, which is important. That's what Jesus' tomb was, but other tombs are not single chamber because they were used by entire families. And it's the location where it's in, it used to be a quarry, and then it was turned into a garden around the first century BC, as far as we can tell from excavations there. Then the Christians, they recognized this as the tomb of Jesus, so it was never reused for anything else. No one expanded the tomb, no one buried anyone else in there. And Hadrian comes along around 130 or so, and he's building pagan temples over all these places associated with Jesus. Well, what does he do at the tomb? He builds a double temple to Jupiter and Venus over the place of the tomb of Jesus and at least what they thought was the crucifixion site also. This is a very similar temple to what you see in Rome that Hadrian built to Roma and Venus there. So it's this massive Roman temple. Jupiter, of course, is the king of the gods in the Roman pantheon, or Saturn, also very prominent. But Jupiter here, it seems like he's essentially saying, we're putting our main god over the most important Christian location associated with Jesus, and trying to either get people to forget about Jesus, or they're trying to syncretize Jesus into Roman religion. And we looked at this in other places, like the Grove of Adonis at Bethlehem. Why did he pick Adonis? Possibly because of the birth story of Adonis that's written about in Ovid, where there's kind of a scandal, like his mother is involved in adultery, and that was the Roman view of Jesus's mother too. He picks Jupiter for the tomb of Jesus because Jupiter's the king of the gods. He picks Asclepius for the healing site at Bethesda because Asclepius was the Greek and Roman god of healing, and so on. So all that to say, we've got early testimony about that location. Architecturally, it fits. Archaeologically, it fits. It being a single chamber tomb of that type, it's the only one in the whole Jerusalem area. And so we don't even have other candidates that are viable, really.
So Gordon's tomb is ruled out.
So Gordon's tomb, that one came about in the 19th century as a result of a misunderstanding of the walls of ancient Jerusalem. They saw the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and they saw the Old City walls, which are Ottoman period, 16th century. And he thought, though, that those were the ancient Roman walls. And so he said, this couldn't be the tomb of Jesus because it's inside the walls. So he's looking for another place, and he sees this rock face, and it kind of looks like the face of a skull to him. And he thinks, that fits Golgotha. So is there a tomb near here? And he found a rock-cut tomb. The problem is, first of all, that Golgotha in the Gospels is described as a cranium. Okay, so it was a rounded hill. It wasn't the face of a skull. Second, the tomb that he identified as the tomb of Jesus was a tomb that was carved in the 8th or 7th century BC, the time of Hezekiah, and then it was reused in the Byzantine period. So definitely not this new cut tomb in the first century like the tomb of Jesus.
Yeah. So in the video clip that we watched this morning here promoting tonight, it's a clip of you discussing the ossuary that was brought. Actually, I got a chance to see it when it was brought to SBL conference in Toronto. So I got a firsthand view of the ossuary. Can you explain to us what an ossuary is, because it's obviously not a coffin. It's only probably about this long, right? And how it was used, and then this particular ossuary.
Yeah, so you're talking about what's called the James Ossuary. So it has this inscription in Aramaic on it that says, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. So people are thinking, oh, that sounds familiar. This is from first century Jerusalem, presumably. Is this legit? Is this real? Or did somebody forge this because they knew it would be worth a lot of money? So an ossuary, first of all, is a bone box. Now, they would bury someone in a tomb, like the tomb of Jesus, and then about a year later, they would go and they would collect the bones off of the burial bench, and they would put them inside this ossuary, and then they would put it on a shelf in the tomb. And sometimes they would write the name of the person who is buried in there. And oftentimes, they would write the person's name and the name of their father, or the person's name and their profession. Well, we have it's a unique inscription, actually, this one. It's not just somewhat unique.
It's in Aramaic.
Yes, right? It's unique because not only does it give us the name of the deceased, but it also gives us his father's name and his brother's name. Now, of all the ossuary inscriptions that have been discovered, there's only one other one that names the brother. So that is very odd, but that one doesn't name the father too. So it seems like maybe they didn't know who the father was and they're just trying to give an association. But here we have the whole lineage, connection of the family. And we read that passage in Josephus, and we know who James is. We know that James is the brother of Jesus. We know that he's the son of Joseph. That's the only James that we know about. So there are these questions then, is this ossuary authentic? There was a geological analysis done. It fits first century Jerusalem. It's the right kind of stone, and there's the right patina on the stone. So it seems like it was actually in a first century tomb. So then they focused on the inscription itself, and they're looking at it, and okay, it looks legit. It looks like first century Aramaic, but they're saying, was it forged, or was part of it forged? So then they looked at the patina, which is the residue in all of the letters. So there's ancient residue in the entire inscription, even the Jesus part. So we know that it was all written at the same time in the first century. It wasn't added on later. And that tells us that it's probably talking about Jesus Christ, because there was a statistical study done that looked at that relationship of names. And based on the frequency of names, based on the population of Jerusalem in the first century, he came to the conclusion that there were less than 2 people who would have fit that relationship of names. And of course, the way that it's talked about, adding the brother on, we know that this Jesus was very famous. So it's just very likely, I think, that was James's ossuary, and therefore a first century inscription mentioning Jesus.
Yeah, that is incredible. I remember being so impressed when I looked at it behind the plexiglass case in Toronto, and realizing that the Apostle James, who wrote the epistle, and his bones would have been in that. That is so cool. I love this stuff.
It is.
I love this stuff. So one last question before we take our break, and then we will come back with your questions that you have texted in, and that is the Shroud of Turin. What do you think about that? What is it, for those people who haven't heard about it, and what do you think about its authenticity?
So the Shroud of Turin we could call it both a relic and an artifact, but it is claimed to be the burial shroud of Jesus, at least by some people and by the Catholic Church. What exactly is it? When does it date to? Well, there were radiocarbon tests done on a section of it that say that it came from the medieval period, but there have been studies going back and looking at that and critiquing it and saying that, no, actually, they probably tested a section of the shroud that was repaired in the medieval period. They actually added material back into it. So they did other types of analysis of the shroud, and the weave is actually consistent with what we would find for burial shrouds in 1st and 2nd century Judea. We know that because there actually have been a couple other burial shrouds found in tombs. The pollen samples are consistent with that part of the world also. So I would say at least it's probably a burial shroud from the Roman period in Judea. Physicists, scientists, they can't explain how in antiquity you could get that image onto the shroud. I mean, if you look at it, it looks like a guy who's laying down, buried, and it even looks like he underwent crucifixion and got beat before that. So it is very consistent with what we might expect from Jesus or someone who is crucified. Whether or not it's the burial shroud of Jesus, I don't know. There are ancient texts about Jesus' burial shroud and how it was preserved, and it went from place to place. So maybe, but I would say at least it's a burial shroud from that time and region.
Yeah. In The Chosen, I don't know how many of you have seen that, but in The Chosen, there's a scene where Mary has kept the face cloth. And you when you look at it and look at the tenderness with which she hands that, and I know it's all fiction right there, but when you look at the tenderness with which she has kept and protected that, and then hands it over to Mary Magdalene, you can certainly see the plausibility, just knowing human nature and how we all tend to be around artifacts or things that we've kept of parents or grandparents. You could certainly see something like that being legitimate. But we're going to take a break right now. Let me encourage you, after the next session, where we will entertain your questions, and if we don't get enough of yours, I've got a page of Old Testament. We haven't gotten to the Old Testament yet. But please take a look at both of Dr. Kennedy's books, Unearthing the Bible and Excavating the Evidence for Jesus. A lot of our questions have come from the material in The Evidence for Jesus book. I would highly recommend it, and he'll be willing, after the session is over tonight, to autograph your copy if you'd like that. So let's take a break right now and come back in 15 minutes, and we'll pick up where we left off. Well, welcome back. We're glad you stayed for the last half. You guys wrote in some amazing questions. And I'd like to begin, Dr. Kennedy, by just having you comment on the discoveries that you've made personally in Sudan and how they relate to a more accurate dating of the Exodus. Because I know there have been some who have even questioned the presence of Jews in ancient Egypt, much less the Exodus. So if you could comment on that.
Right, and we actually have some photos, I think, that I put in the slides of this. So I can't take all the credit for this discovery. It was excavated before I was even born, but it was fairly unknown and not well documented and published. So I had decided to make a project where I went there and analyzed the inscriptions and photographed them, because we couldn't find photographs of them anywhere.
Dr. Meyer said that you actually had to dress up like Indiana Jones to get in there.
No, not exactly. He was embellishing, but it was a bit of a process to get the visa and get permits and approval and arrange everything to get to the site, it was about a day and a half drive from Khartoum. So it wasn't easy to get to, but we get there to this Egyptian temple, which was built during the reign of Amenhotep III. So he was in power around 1400 BC. And one of the inscriptions, he mentions all these groups of nomads, and he associates something with each of these groups, and in particular, a deity with a few of them. And one of these groups, it says that they're the nomads of Yahweh. So this is the first inscription, the earliest inscription mentioning Yahweh that's ever been discovered. And it's talking about nomads associated with Yahweh who are geographically placed to the east of Egypt. So this would be during the wandering period, in the right time of the wandering period. And again, this is around 1400 BC. So that's at the end of this 40-year period after the wilderness, before the conquest starts. So not only does that tell us that the Egyptians were familiar with the Israelites, that the Israelites were wandering, but they knew the personal name of God, Yahweh, which had just been revealed to Moses a bit before the Exodus. And it also helps us to confirm the biblical date for the Exodus, which would have been in then the middle of the 15th century BC.
That's amazing. And it's been known for some time, but you're the one that was able to bring it to scholarship.
So I published a technical article on the inscription with a lot of different photos and an analysis of the writing, so that, yes, people would have a more thorough article on that. It had just been mentioned in passing a few times. And in fact, there was a mistake in one of the readings. And so I wanted to make sure that people had the right information and they could really see what it looked like, instead of just reading, oh, there's this inscription that mentions Yahweh, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. Have you studied hieroglyphics? You're able to read that yourself?
Yes, when I was at University of Toronto, that was one of my courses.
That's awesome. That is awesome. So here's some of the questions. What discovery has been the most surprising and impacting to you personally?
Well, that's one of them, but I suppose another one might be the Nazareth inscription. This is one of my favorites. It's actually in the book because it connects to the life of Jesus, actually to his tomb and to the resurrection story. So you read in Matthew 28 that the Roman soldiers come back and they say, the body of Jesus is gone. And the religious authorities tell them, oh, here's some money, go spread the story that the disciples stole the body of Jesus, and we'll make sure that you don't get in trouble with the governor. And so that's what people heard from the Roman perspective. Well, in this inscription, which was found in Nazareth in the 1800s, not in an excavation, a legal one anyway, but that's where it turned up. It's a first century edict or rescript, we call it, of the emperor. So he wrote a letter about a new law. And in this inscription, it says that there is a new penalty for this crime. And the penalty is death. So it's very extreme. And the crime is if you have taken a body with wicked intent, it says, out of a stone-sealed sepulcher tomb. And that's the type of tomb that Jesus was buried in. That's not the type of tomb that Romans were buried in. They were usually cremated and put in urns also. So it's the same type of tomb. It pops up in Nazareth. Remember, the early Christians were called Nazarenes. So they know that Jesus is from Nazareth. Maybe that's what they want to make a point there. And this seems to come from the time of Claudius. He became emperor in 41. So this is just 8 years or so after the resurrection. Really, really close. And it seems to tell us that the Romans knew about the story of the resurrection, and it was having a drastic impact on the empire. And they wanted to put a stop to that and anything like that happening again. And their version was the disciples must have stolen it.
Wow. What findings that have you uncovered that give you the greatest confidence in the reliability of Scripture?
Well, some of my favorites, or ones that I would put in that category, not the ones that I have uncovered, but if we go back to the Old Testament, I would put the Tel Dan Stele as one of the top ones, because when this was discovered in 1993, it was the first evidence from around the time of David that mentioned David as the king of Israel. So up until that point in the 80s and the early 90s, a lot of archaeologists were starting to say David was a mythical character. We have no evidence for his existence outside of the Bible. And then this was discovered. It was an Aramean victory inscription that talked about the defeat of these Israelite kings, and it said that they were from the house of David, which is a phrase that we see in the Old Testament. So they're saying that David was the founder of this Israelite dynasty of kings. So they're acknowledging that, and suddenly the narrative in scholarship changed like overnight. And there were a few people that tried to argue against it, but almost everyone accepts it now.
Wow. Is Josephus considered a good source that was current in Jesus' era, and did he give witness to the existence of Jesus?
Yes, Josephus is an extremely valuable source, especially for the first century, because Josephus lived during the first century. He was born in Judea. He was actually a commander in the first revolt against the Romans. And so he knew the land, and he knew the language, and he knew the people and all that. And he did extensive research as well, wrote a biography of Herod's life, essentially. So he's a very, very helpful resource for us. And yes, he did give witness to the existence of Jesus. We have two passages from Josephus' writing that mention Jesus. The first one talks about Jesus as the brother of James, when it's talking about the martyrdom of James in Jerusalem. And the other passage talks more broadly about Jesus, and he says things like, he was known to be a virtuous man, he was a teacher, he had disciples, he performed some wondrous acts, like miracles is, I think, what he's referring to, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And then he also says that it was reported that he resurrected 3 days later. So he doesn't say that he believes that, but he said that it's reported.
Wow. So we're going to jump around a little bit between New Testament and Old Testament. And when you visit Israel, you have to really stay on top of that, because one day you're in a New Testament site and the afternoon you're in an Old Testament site, because obviously it's all in the same general geography. So we're jumping around a little bit between the Testaments. But one of my favorite places to go in Israel is to stand on Mount Gerizim, which is in the West Bank, and look across this valley where Shechem, the ruins of ancient Shechem, sit in the valley, and you see Mount Ebal on the other side of this valley. And you can imagine the story that comes out of the Old Testament about when the Israelites under Joshua's leadership first arrive, and they go to Shechem and they split the tribes up, half the tribe of the tribes on Mount Gerizim, the other half on Mount Ebal, and then 25,000 Levites down on Shechem recite the blessings and the curses of the covenant, and the people follow after them. And even when you read the story and when you're there, you're looking at Shechem probably 800, maybe 1,000 feet below the summit of Gerizim, and you wonder how in the world would they hear 25,000 Levites until you stop and listen, and you can hear dogs barking down in Shechem. So you know that the sound would have carried. Well, one of your questions, and it was actually one of mine as well, is about a recent tablet that's been found on Mount Ebal, and just what your comments are about the name of God and the things that are discovered in that tablet.
So there was a very small lead artifact, just a little over 2 centimeters wide, that was discovered while sifting through previously excavated material from older excavations there. And the claim is that they found an ancient Hebrew inscription on this tablet, and that it connects to cursing and has the name of God, Yahweh, on there. So it hasn't been published yet, so I can't really comment too much on it. I've seen some photos, but I haven't seen the scans that they talk about. So I would just wait until that publication comes out and we can evaluate it. Obviously, it could be really significant, but I think we just need to wait until the data's out there.
So if you'll share your cell phone number with us, we'll give you a call as soon as that comes out. Awesome. All right, next question has to do with Jerusalem. Is what is currently known as the Temple Mount the actual site of the Old Testament temple?
Yes, it is. So the idea that the Temple Mount was located in the city of David just doesn't work. There's many reasons, but the two biggest ones, other than it's been known as the Temple Mount for all of history, is that Josephus gives us the dimensions of the Temple Mount during the first century. And if we look at those, you actually can't fit that in the city of David. The second issue is that you put your holy place up high on the top of a mountain, okay? So the temple was put up on Mount Moriah. And the city of David is low, it's down. So you don't put your holy place down in the valley like that. So it doesn't make sense for many reasons. And I don't know one archaeologist who thinks that.
Okay. So the Temple Mount, regardless of where we might think the actual Herod's temple would have been built, Herod built the Temple Mount, right? Is that correct?
He expanded it, yes. The Hasmoneans worked on it too. So, I mean, you have Solomon initially building there, and then they kept constructing this platform over time. So Herod made it bigger, but the Hasmoneans did quite a bit of work on it earlier too.
Okay. Is the city of Salem in Melchizedek's period, Abraham, the earliest iteration of the city of David and the current Jerusalem? And does Mount Moriah, the Abraham and Isaac account, take place on the same site as Jesus' crucifixion?
Yes, Salem was the older name for Jerusalem. We see that in Genesis, but we also see that in texts such as the Egyptian execration text from around the time of Abraham, what we call the Middle Bronze Age. So Genesis gets that right. There was a name change. And Mount Moriah, well, so in Genesis it says they're in the region of Moriah, but it would have been in what's Jerusalem today, the Jerusalem area, yeah. We couldn't pinpoint exactly where that almost sacrifice with Isaac was, but we can definitely say that it's in Jerusalem there.
And doesn't Solomon say in Chronicles that he puts the temple on Mount Moriah?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. What about the timing of Easter? Is there evidence we celebrate Christ's resurrection on the right day, or is there evidence it was changed to the day that exalted the god Estra?
So like we talked about earlier, looking at the archaeology of Jesus, we can actually pinpoint the date of the crucifixion because of the data in the biblical text. But we also know that Easter is, or the resurrection day, it's tied to Passover. So it's not just pulled from some other holiday. It's tied to a holiday, a festival that has been going on for millennia.
Okay. Old Testament, Egypt. Who do you think was the Pharaoh who enslaved the Israelites?
So the Pharaoh who enslaved them, I was thinking the Exodus Pharaoh. I think the Pharaoh who enslaved them was happened around 1570 BC or something, when what's called the 18th dynasty started, the New Kingdom. And almost the first was his name. But if we're talking about the Pharaoh, the Exodus, I would say it's probably a Pharaoh by the name of Amenhotep II. And we have a lot of really interesting evidence that connects to his time, besides just basic chronology. Okay. And you can read about some of that in my book, but there are some articles there.
Which book?
In the Unearthing the Bible one.
Okay.
But there are some articles out there that some other scholars have written that really get into the details very well on that issue of the Pharaoh, the Exodus.
Okay. Noah's Ark. Is the recent finding about land mold, which looks like Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat, legit?
I'm not sure exactly what this one's talking about, because I don't know if they're saying Mount Ararat as proposed by someone else or what we would call Mount Ararat today. So there are a couple of geologic formations that are very interesting looking, and they have like the shape of a boat. But those are not on what we understand to be Mount Ararat. So I can tell you, we don't know, or we don't have the remains of the ark right now. There's always claims or new ideas coming up, but none of them have really passed the tests, so to speak. So we're still looking. I don't know if we'll ever find it. But interestingly, we do have some tablets from ancient Mesopotamia going back as far as about 1900 BC that talk about the Noah flood story.
Interesting. Sodom and Gomorrah. I've seen some pretty far-fetched videos on YouTube. I know this is the question that you send in. There's no snickering allowed here. I know that Eric Metaxas talks about the subject, about the location of Sodom and Gomorrah. You have some different opinions about that?
Yeah, so there's basically two major candidate sites for Sodom. And one is on the northeastern side of the Dead Sea, and that's called Tal Hammam, and that's being excavated right now. And then there's another one that's more central east to southeast side of the Dead Sea, and that's called Babadra, and that's been excavated in the past. And that's one that has, I think, been connected more until recently. This other site got a lot of press, but essentially, there are some problems with both of the sites, really. But I would place Sodom more on that central to southern eastern side of the Dead Sea, because there's one location that we can be sure about. That's Zoar or Bela. It's the one city that survived of the five. And that one is marked on what's called the Madaba map from the 6th century. And there have been excavations in that area that if they found a cemetery that has inscriptions mentioning the name of the city is Zoar, so we know where that was. Also some unpublished excavations right next to it, right next to this later Zoar, that come back early as the early Bronze Age. So we know it was around in the time of Abraham even. So that, I think, would put it more in that southerly area of the Dead Sea. But it's a question that needs some more investigation.
So how are sites selected? How do archaeologists arrive at a decision to explore a certain site?
Well, they're going to have an interest probably in a specific site or a specific question. But as far as locating something, the Bible is a great geographic tool because it has all this information about names and directions and what geographic features these places are next to. So even scholars who are very skeptical of the Bible as a historical source, they recognize its value as a geographic source. And so it's used in identifying sites very often. Of course, we have writings from the Egyptians, for example. They'll list out the names of different sites, and that's helpful too. Another way that we discover sites, besides just doing archaeological work, is that oftentimes the names from antiquity are actually preserved in some form. Usually they have transitioned through Greek into Arabic, or sometimes just from Canaanite or Hebrew into Arabic. So a lot of times there's a little village or some location that carries the ancient name with it. And so many times those have been explored and they found, oh, yep, that is this biblical site that has a very similar name.
So when you arrive at a site, one of the things you shared with us back in the office is that you don't drag a whole bunch of undergraduates to a site for cheap labor. When you go, you usually go with PhDs and master's students. When you arrive at a site, walk us through the process that you will follow.
So to begin with, we would do some drone photography and map the site so that we know what it looks like overall. And then we would walk the site in a grid, essentially. So we're kind of doing a surface survey, trying to find whatever pieces of architecture that are visible to us, both looking on the ground and also the drone photography really helps with that. Sometimes we can see the outlines of structures through that we couldn't see walking around. And you can pick up pieces of pottery from the surface, so you see, all right, there was occupation here, and here's some of the periods that are represented. And so we try to find specific areas of the site which we think will be the best for excavating. They'll give us the most results because we can't excavate the whole site. We don't have the manpower, the time, the funding for that. So we might pick out, say, 4 or 5 squares, and these squares are going to be 5 meters by 5 meters. So they're not that big, right? They're not even going to be an entire building, just one square anyway. So we'll do that, And then we will lay out those squares. So we'll put markers in the ground so we keep everything correct, still according to the 5x5 measurements. And then we will start excavating, and you peel back the layers basically.
By hand?
Yes, with hand tools. So with picks, with shovels, or a type of shovel that's actually more like a hoe where you can kind of scrape the ground off. We don't want to dig holes. We want to remove just small amounts of soil as we go over the entire square and keep it even. Because say you come across the top of a wall, but somewhere else you accidentally dug way too deep and you went through the floor of that building. We want to avoid that. So wherever we find something, then we'll slow down, and then we can excavate more carefully so that we can expose the structure, we can expose the floor with all the materials on it. And of course, we're going to be recording continuously as we're doing this. We're collecting all the pottery, we're collecting whatever artifacts we might find, taking photographs at different stages, doing drawings.
Do you ever feel like that you're in a futile location, you have to give up?
Yeah, that happens sometimes. Sometimes you're digging for days and days and you're just going through dirt. I mean, usually you're going to be finding something like pieces of pottery and maybe some coins, but you might come across no structures at all. In fact, that happened in the last excavation I was directing. It was probably 8 days of digging this square, going down about 8 feet until we finally hit structures. And so people were starting to lose a little bit of hope, but some of us knew we'd eventually get there, and they did. So it was good and encouraging to them who didn't have as much experience with things like that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Talk to us a little bit about your journey of faith. How did you start out with this interest? How did it develop? And also, how have your findings confirmed your personal faith?
So I always had an interest in history. It was one of my favorite subjects in elementary school, and I liked reading ancient literature too. I had read the Iliad and the Odyssey, and then my teacher in 4th grade gave me a book about the excavation of Troy. Okay, so where the Iliad took place, or much of it. And then I understood from that there were people who were actually going out and digging at these ancient cities and finding these things. And before, that had never even occurred to me. I just sort of thought, okay, people in ancient times wrote down these history texts and then they passed them on and so forth. So that kind of got me started in thinking about archaeology. But then in high school, I started reading a lot more archaeology connected to the Bible and saw how that helped us to understand the context of Scripture better and also to demonstrate the reliability of Scripture. So I thought, this is really interesting to me. I can see how it can be beneficial, and I'll try to study it and see if I can do anything with it. And so I just kept going and eventually went into that field.
It is addictive. In 2008, Westgate for our 20th anniversary, sent us on a trip to Israel with maybe, I think, 6 other couples. And one of the things we asked to be included in the trip was an opportunity to do some digging. And in the area of Maresha, which is south and west of Jerusalem, an area that's characterized by a lot of caves, a group of archaeologists were uncovering the findings in these caves. And when we got there, there was an area, not 5 meters, but 3 feet, probably to accommodate those of us who were there. But we each of us were assigned an area that was marked off with 3 feet. And when you ran into something, we were given a trowel and a brush. Of course, we're all novices at this, right? And when you found something, you shouted "Oompa," and the supervising archaeologist would come over and catalog what you found. Well, in my 3 square feet, we were there for about probably 45 minutes, and I found nothing. And everybody around me in our group was shouting "Oompa," because they were coming up with pieces of pottery and whatever. And the gal said, "All right, our time is up." And in frustration, I took my trowel and I jabbed it in the wall of the little bit of the hole that I had dug. And as the earth peeled back from that hole, what fell out was an ancient oil lamp, perfectly intact. Everyone else was finding pieces of stuff. Mine was perfectly intact. And when the archaeologists got excited, I realized we were, but it already still had the soot on it around where the wick of the lamp was. And that, when you've done that, I tell you, you're ready to sign me up, right? I'm ready to keep doing it.
You did really well for 1 hour of digging.
That's awesome. That is awesome. All right, a few last questions, if I may. One of the places I haven't been that I just have a real longing to visit is Hebron. When you read about Abraham buying the field so that he can bury Sarah there, and very likely Abraham was buried there in Hebron. And there's a cave apparently that you're able to visit. How authentic is that? And what do you think about Hebron as a site?
So the cave of Machpelah is on the slide, you can see there. So it is this cave that was carved out way back in ancient times. And there is archaeological material there that's been found that dates to the time of Abraham, and it's right in the Hebron area. So it's very plausible. I mean, I would say, yes, it is the location. We just can't say archaeologically for sure that it is, because we don't have some inscription from that time stating it's the cave of Sarah and Abraham. But everything's consistent with that. And Hebron has been partially excavated too. It connects to various stories in the Bible. You can see some of the remains there, so it's not some unknown location. But like most of the sites actually that are in the Bible, we know where they are, and we have some kind of archaeology that connects to biblical time periods.
Are there other things to see at Hebron besides the cave?
Yeah, you can see some of the city wall going back to the early times when it was a Canaanite city called Kiryat Arba. You can see part of a street. You can see some other houses. So yeah, there are quite a few things to look at still.
That's awesome. That is awesome. What do you think of the ruins of Jericho from the time of Joshua?
So this is a really important site, I think, and one of my favorites that I'm most interested in. But it's also one that's been really controversial, and the whole conquest and Exodus has essentially been dismissed by the majority of scholars today as unhistorical. And one of the key sites in this whole discussion is Jericho. Now, Jericho was excavated earlier in the 20th century, and the head of that expedition, his name was John Garstang, he was much more positive about the findings correlating to Joshua. But then another archaeologist came along, Kathleen Kenyon, and excavated there in the 50s, and her conclusions were very, very different. So she actually never published her data. It didn't come out until after she was dead, but she published her conclusions, and everyone, or most people, just took them as that's the truth. She argued that Jericho was destroyed around 1550 BC, so way too early for the conquest. However, if you look at what she found, the manner in which it was destroyed was exactly consistent with the biblical narrative. So the walls fell down on top of themselves and formed this sort of ramp. You can see that the red fallen mud bricks there in front of the stone retaining wall. And we read about that exact scenario in Joshua 6. And then there's a massive fire destruction over the city that was found archaeologically, and the grain in the city was not looted, which normally the armies would have done that. So all these huge storage jars full of grain were discovered in the fire destruction. That also tells us that it happened soon after harvest, which is the time that's indicated in the biblical text too. So then it really comes to when was this destroyed? Was it 1550? Was it 1500, as some of the newer excavations say? Or was it 1400 BC, as it would connect with Joshua and the conquest? Well, there's two really important things about that date. First of all is the pottery that was discovered there. So they found some of what's called Cypriot bichrome. All the excavations found this. And this was an imported pottery, kind of a fancy type of pottery. Sometimes the Canaanites copied it and made it. But this comes into play around 1600 BC, and then it's used into the sort of Moses and Joshua period. And then they found another type that's even more important, and that is, it was called chocolate on whiteware. So it's kind of like this creamy slip pottery with brown paint on it. And that is essentially 1500 to 1400 BC is when that comes in. So we're getting a lot closer. Well, we're in that time period, essentially. But then one of the excavators found these Egyptian scarabs, and he found some of them were from the 1400s BC, the 15th century. And in particular, the really important ones are of Pharaoh Hatshepsut. So she was a queen that ruled as Pharaoh for a bit before the Exodus. And then the last one attested there is from Amenhotep III, and he ruled around 1400 BC. So he's actually who we would expect to be last attested if it was destroyed in 1400. So I think the archaeology has a very compelling case for corroborating the Joshua narrative.
And that's interesting because whenever we've been there and I've asked about Jericho, all the guides that we've had have downplayed its significance.
Yeah, the guides are very confused about Jericho. They don't know what to look at. They don't know what to think. So it's tough. They basically just go there and read the Bible story, and they're not sure what to say.
Yeah. Where are you going next? Are you allowed
for a project?
Say? Yeah.
Yes. So I'm excavating at a site called Khirbet Et Tel, which is traditionally regarded as the site of Ai, mentioned in Genesis and also Joshua. And so there have been some different perspectives on that site over the last few decades. So I'm trying to clarify some of that and see what connects to the biblical text and see what new things we can find to make it a little bit clearer.
Where does funding come from for an expedition like you're talking about?
Basically from private donors or from research institutes that get funding from private donors for those specific things.
Yeah.
The universities generally don't have much of a budget, if any budget, to fund excavations. It's very expensive, and they have other things that they want to spend money on or need to spend money on. So you basically have to look for outside sources.
Well, one last question about the city of David. What are some of the recent discoveries in the city of David, and have you worked? If I understood, you've worked in the city of David?
I did for a short time. I helped with a dig there, but I didn't do a lot of work, and I wasn't in a director or staff position. But yeah, I was on the ground seeing what they were doing. So I would say two really important things to take away from City of David excavations over the last several years. First one is very recent, where they found these boule, so it's like these clay stamp seals, of both King Hezekiah and one that says Isaiah the prophet. So that was the first time that Hezekiah's seal had been found in an actual excavation. There were a lot of them that had been just discovered, looted. They were on the antiquities market, but this one really showed those others were authentic. And it comes from about 700 BC context, so it's the right one, right time, right place. But right in that same area, they found one of this, says Isaiah the prophet. So that's the first time that we have archaeological evidence of Isaiah. So that was really important. And then the other thing that I think is fascinating with the city of David is in about 2005, they were doing some salvage excavation there when they were building a new visitor center, and they discovered this huge stone structure. And we thought that there was probably something there, but no one had been able to dig there before. And so Eilat Mazar was the one working on that site, and she thinks that she found the palace of David And it's, it was constructed about 1000 BC, so it's the right time. It's the right location in Jerusalem. And then the discoveries within that demonstrate that it was used by the royal administration until the time of the Babylonian destruction. So I really think it is the Palace of David. So it's an immensely important excavation.
And it's still being worked on right now?
Currently, I think it's in hiatus, but hopefully they'll continue on.
Yeah. Well, I got to say, thank you for taking your time to be with us. I don't think I'm the only one that is intrigued by these kinds of subjects and have my faith encouraged, and to understand that there's someone of your caliber of scholarship who is actually defending Scripture based on what you've researched is really encouraging. And we just want to say thank you for being here tonight and taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Kennedy has agreed to be at the back to sign books if you would like to have him sign one of the books that you would purchase. And let's have a word of prayer before we go. Father, thank you that you have, even though we're the generation that have faith in you, even though we've not seen you. And I thank you for the blessing of having faith without having physically seen you. But Lord, we thank you for the evidence that seems to be all around us and even seems to be increasing in intensity and in detail of your Scripture, of your word, of your servants, all of it dovetailing together. And Lord, thank you. Thank you for Dr. Kennedy. I pray your blessing over him. I pray in the projects that he has in the pipeline that you would provide the benefactors and the funds for him to do exactly what he's doing, Lord, and that is to help authenticate the validity of your word based on what we find in the evidence in archaeology. So we pray your blessing over him and everything he sets his hand to do. Pray your blessing over this congregation and over this gathering. We ask, Lord, that you would keep us in the center of your purposes and plans as you get ready to send an outpouring of your Holy Spirit, bringing revival to this land. We give you praise in Jesus' name. Amen. 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 God bless you.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah,